unexpectedly, so unexpectedly, the inflation rate has hit another 40-year high, shattering every record. That's what Joe Biden is here to do. He's here to make history by shattering every bad record there is to shatter. According to the Wall Street Journal, U.S. consumer inflation accelerated to 9.1% in June, a pace not seen in more than 4 decades, adding pressure on the Federal Reserve to act more aggressively to slow rapid price increases throughout the economy. The Consumer Price Index advance for the 12 months ending in June was the fastest pace since November 1981, according to the Labor Department. A big jump in gasoline prices, up 11.2% from the previous month, nearly 60% from a year earlier, drove much of the increase. Shelter and food prices were also major contributors, but there are no areas of the American economy that are not inflating at this point. The June inflation reading exceeded May's 8.6% rate, which, by the way, gave the lie to the idea that we had hit an inflection point on inflation. Last month, there was a lot of talk that we had already hit peak inflation. It turns out that was not true. The June inflation, again, was higher than May. That prompted investors and analysts to debate whether the Fed would consider a 1 percentage point rate increase rather than a 0.75 point rise later this month. The truth is, they probably need to wallop everybody with like a 1.5% increase. All of these incremental increases, they ain't going to do it. I was listening to a podcast the other day with Mohamed El-Erian of Allianz, who's been a guest on this program. And Mohamed El-Erian was saying correctly that the big problem here is that the Fed had the opportunity to hit the brake hard enough to actually stop the inflation, but they risked tipping over into a recession. And instead, they decided to sort of tap the brakes. And the problem is the car has not slowed down nearly enough. And so now they're going to have to slam the brakes. They're not going to have to hit the brakes firmly. They have to slam the brakes. And the problem is when you slam the brakes, there's a very good shot that the passenger ejects right through the windshield because ain't nobody wearing a seatbelt around here. Slowing demand is key to the Fed's goal of restoring price stability in an economy that is still struggling with supply issues, according to the Wall Street Journal. Raising interest rates elevates the risk of a recession. Core prices, excluding volatile food and energy, increased by 5.9% in June from a year earlier. That is slightly less than May's 6.0% gain, according to the Labor Department. On a month-to-month basis, core prices rose at 0.7% in June. That's a little bit more than they did in May. Stocks declined on Wednesday after wavering for much of the day, with the S&P 500 index falling by 0.5%. Bond yields jumped following the inflation report. Yields on longer-term treasuries quickly gave up those gains. Nobody knows where to put their money at this point, considering there are no safe havens. Retailers' ability to shut unwanted inventory could test whether pricing is returning to pre-pandemic patterns. Some retailers like Target have already said they are planning big discounts in order to get rid of all of their unwanted inventory. A lot of others with robust warehouse capacity like Walmart are likely to hold on to their excess inventory, according to analysts. Discounts haven't shown up prominently in inflation figures so far. Prices for apparel, home goods, both of those were on the rise. And again, all of this is the result of terrible economic policy from the Biden administration. Yes, there have been supply chain shocks. Yes, COVID created those supply chain shocks. Sure, war in Ukraine isn't helping things. But the simple fact of the matter is that the inflation rate in the United States is not, as Joe Biden likes to lie, the lowest in the Western world. In fact, it is one of the highest in the Western world. And that is because Joe Biden's proposal, his entire economic strategy, was rooted in fire hosing money at people. Because this is part of Democrats' core ideological belief, which is that all inequity in the system, all evils in the system can be fixed by helicopter cash. If you just drop money on people, this will magically fix all of the problems. It will rectify all of the inequalities that plague the evil systemic American society. Well, there's only one problem with that, which is that what you do when you helicopter cash is you inflate things. And this is axiomatic. And yet the axioms were supposedly never going to apply again. And the evidence for that was that in 2008, 2009, during the Great Recession, that there was a rather large increase in spending in the United States and inflation didn't follow. But that's because demand was already leveled off. Here, you had demand that was super hot because we had heated up the amount of money in the economy. And then you had supply chains. And then you decided to pour more money on top of all of that. Well, I think it's worthwhile remembering here that all of these supposed experts in the Biden administration were telling us not all that long ago that everything was going to be fine. You'll remember that it was transitory inflation according to the Federal Reserve until a few months ago. And you'll remember that back in December, Joe Biden said that inflation had already hit its peak, that we were already on the way down. This is in December. I note that the calendar, according to my calendar right here, it says that it is now July. Here is Joe Biden circa December.
Inflation has just hit nearly a 40-year high. Do you think this is the peak of those prices, or should Americans brace for
I think it's the peak of the crisis, and I think you'll see it change sooner, quicker, and more rapidly than it will take than most people think. Every other aspect of the economy is racing ahead. It's doing incredibly well. We've never had this kind of growth in 60 years.
That was in December. So yeah, that was just wrong. In June of 2021, Ron Klain, who's trying to tweet his way through this crisis, he just goes on Twitter and he finds some mild piece of good news, and then he tweets it out. So yesterday, he was spending all of his day tweeting out news that the gas prices had dipped over the past 30 days to $4.60 a gallon, which is still a whopping price that is penalizing Americans for the great crime of driving to the grocery store. Ronald Klain, June 16th, 2021, quote, "There are going to be transitory impacts of restarting an economy that was shut down. But a key point in the Fed forecast today, inflation projected down to 2.1% in 2022. If by 2.1% in 2022, they mean like 9%, then they got that one right, just nailed it. Ron Klain, right on the money as per our usual arrangement. Now, this has some serious impacts on average Americans. I mean, we're not just talking about you're spending too much money at the grocery store. We're talking about the fact that all the wage gains that got created over the past several years have now been eaten up by inflation. According to Fox Business, the average American worker has lost $3,400 in annual income as a result of skyrocketing inflation since Biden took office 18 months ago. Overall, the CPI surged 9.1% year over year in June. This means a decline in actual income. That amounts to roughly $3,400 yearly for income decrease for the average worker. That is $6,800 for each family. Just in the last 18 months. That is a massive reduction. According to E.J. Antoni, research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, quote, "There are plenty of families that's more than their food budget for the entire year. I can't emphasize how much this is really crushing consumers." And it's true, by the way, that you're seeing these bottlenecks in like every area of the American economy. If you talk to local business people are suffering. They cannot find people to work the jobs because they don't have enough money to pay the inflated wages that would get people off their can because there's a real shortage of labor in the market, right? The unemployment rate is still really, really low. They are running into supply chain issues at every turn, running out of like basic products. I was at a restaurant recently, it was a breakfast restaurant. They literally run out of cream cheese and they were like, we have to wait until next week and to get some more cream. It's like a bagel shop. So all of this is really crippling American businesses. And when that happens, you're likely to see a recession. And that recession is only going to be exacerbated by the moves that the Federal Reserve does have to make in order to tamp down the inflationary spiral that we are currently in. Now, the White House is, of course, taking the world's dumbest tack because this is what they do. So Karine Jean-Pierre, the eminently untalented press secretary for the Biden White House, she tweeted out, "The anti-inflation reconciliation bill the president is fighting for would lower inflation by empowering Medicare to negotiate down the cost of prescription drugs and save consumers and taxpayers money at the same time. Congressional Republicans oppose it, tooth and nail." So by anti-inflation reconciliation bill, she means the giant trillions-dollar large Build Back Better plan. They're now trying to rebrand it and then throw it back out there as though this is going to fix the economic problem. It is incredible that when faced with the prospect that they have dug themselves into a massive hole, their solution is to immediately try to find some sort of digger and then just keep digging all the way until they actually hit China. Like physically hit the core of the earth and just keep going all the way through. The first rule of holes is to stop digging. But for this White House, the first rule of holes is, why won't the Republicans come on in here with a shovel and help me dig even deeper? The fact that they're still pushing a form of Build Back Better is insanity. It also happens to be politically inept. And the simple fact is Joe Manchin in West Virginia ain't going to vote for that. He's already said he's not going to vote for that. Meanwhile, Joe Biden put out a statement of his own. This is the White House statement, and it is so unbelievably tone deaf because when people are enmeshed in economic suffering, the thing that is not going to help them is when you say to them, you must be crazy, everything's fine. First of all, it's pretty rare that solution has ever worked in any sort of political relationship. I mean, from marriage on up. When is the last time your spouse was really, really ticked about something and you're like, you know what? Calm down, everything's fine. When was the last time that has worked? And when you're talking about the American people who are losing thousands of dollars every year thanks to your inflationary policies, Joe Biden sitting there going, everything's fine, that is not exactly going to calm the roiled waters here. Here's President Biden's statement. I mean, this is so tone deaf. But I mean, he may actually be fully tone deaf at this point, like physically. He says, quote, "While today's headline inflation reading is unacceptably high, it is also out of date. Energy alone comprised nearly half of the monthly increase in inflation. Today's data does not reflect the full impact of nearly 30 days of decreases in gas prices that have reduced the price of the pump by about 40 cents since mid-June. Those savings are providing important breathing room for American families." Do you feel the breathing room? Do you feel it? Americans, do you feel that breathing room? Thanks to Joe Biden's excellent energy policy. "Other commodities like wheat have fallen sharply since this report," says Joe Biden. "Importantly, today's report shows that what economists call annual core inflation came down for the third month in a row, and is the first month since last year where the annual core inflation rate is below 6%. Wait, who was president last year? And I noticed that 6% is still really, really high. The Fed's target for inflation is 2%. You are now at triple that, and you are bragging about this? Inflation, says Joe Biden, is our most pressing economic challenge. It is hitting almost every country in the world. It is little comfort to Americans to know inflation is also high in Europe and higher in many countries than in America. But it is a reminder that all major economies are battling this COVID-related challenge made worse by Putin's unconscionable aggression. Tackling inflation is my top priority. We need to make more progress more quickly in getting price increases under control, says Joe Biden's White House. Here is what I will do. First, I will continue to do everything I can to bring down the price of gas. I will continue my historic release of oil from our Strategic Petroleum Reserve. By the way, that is the biggest boondoggle pile of nonsense ever. He's released some millions of barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That has marginally lowered prices. I mean, super marginally for a very specific period of time. It does not increase the future supply of oil in the United States. He says, I will continue working with our European allies to put a price cap on Russian oil, sapping Putin of oil revenue. How is that? What? So if we sap Putin of his oil revenue, why is he going to continue to sell us the oil as opposed to, say, India or China? And I will continue to work with the U.S. oil and gas industry to increase production responsibly. Already, the U.S. is producing 12.1 million barrels of oil per day and is on track to break records. And so now he's going to pretend that he's pro-oil and pro-natural gas, which, of course, is eminently untrue. So number one is I'm going to bring down the price of gas by doing, And then he says, I'm going to continue to insist, as I have with urgency recently, reductions in the price of oil must produce lower gas prices for consumers at the pump. The price of oil is down only about 20% since mid-June, but the price of gas has so far fallen only half as much. Well, I mean, that's because there's a lag time between the production of oil and the production of gas. You have to refine oil into gas, you moron. So that means that some of that reduction in price is going to take a while to hit the market. Oil and gas companies must not use this moment as an excuse for profiting by not passing along savings at the pump. Well, maybe they are also saving up for the fact that the minute that this price spike is over, you are going to absolutely crunch them again. Everybody knows that. I mean, this is why people started saving up during the pandemic. When the government fire hosed money into your pocket, why do you put it in the bank? Why weren't you spending all of it? I mean, you were supposed to pass that on in spending. Well, some of you put it in the bank because you knew that at some point the fire hose would stop. Second, says Joe Biden, I will urge Congress to act this month on legislation to reduce the cost of everyday expenses hitting American families, from prescription drugs to utility bills to health insurance premiums, to make more in America. So that is spending more money, which creates more inflation. So solution one, I'm going to yell at the oil companies, and also I'm really not going to increase oil production in any serious way. Second, I'm going to ask people to spend more money in an inflationary cycle to bring down inflation, you see. Third, I will continue to oppose any efforts by Republicans to make things worse by raising taxes on working people or putting Social Security and Medicare on the chopping block every 5 years. Wait, what? What is our entitlement programs, which are mandatory spending under federal law? What exactly are you talking about? And then he says, finally, I'll continue to give the Federal Reserve the room it needs to help it combat inflation. Well, I mean, he doesn't really have any ability to do anything otherwise, and that is literally their job, and they are supposed to be an independent agency. So all of this is bad policy. It is likely to result in nothing much. And what that really means is that Joe Biden just has to count on the Federal Reserve. Now, the problem is that the Federal Reserve, as we say, is going to have to slam on the brakes at this point. Paul Volcker, in order to actually stop inflation in the early 1980s, had to jack up the interest rates to like 20%. Right now, the interest rates in this country are still at 1.5, 2%, 2.5%. We're going to need to get, according to Lawrence Summers, who was first on the ball on this stuff, we're going to need to be at like 5 to 6% to even talk about tamping down inflation at this point. So a 0.75 percentage point increase in the interest rate, 75 basis points, that ain't going to do it. According to the Wall Street Journal, 3 Fed officials who spoke Wednesday didn't say whether they would favor a move to actually increase the interest rates by a full percentage points, which it hasn't done in decades, at a meeting later this month, but they wouldn't rule it out. Everything is in play, Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostock told reporters in Florida. We don't have to make that decision today, said Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester in an interview on Bloomberg Television. Fed officials are set to begin their pre-meeting quiet period on Saturday, leaving little time to shape expectations around their policy plans. But here's the problem. The American people have no trust in the Fed to actually cut down on inflation, which means that the American people are not going to leave that money sitting in the bank. They're going to spend that money before it's worth a lot less, which means more inflation. The way that you enter an inflationary cycle is people have money in the bank. Instead of holding on to that money because they're afraid of inflation eating up the value of the money in the bank, they take the money and they spend the money. And then you get inflation, because if you spend too much money and it's the same number of goods, all the prices go up. So when people lose ability to trust the Fed, what you end up with is a price-wage spiral. You end up with increased inflation. The Federal Reserve has not earned the trust of the American people at any point in here. They clearly don't know what they're doing. And so the notion that the Federal Reserve is going to be single-handedly bringing the inflation rate up and thus tamping down, or bring the interest rates up and then tamping down inflation. That seems rather pie in the sky without any sort of pain whatsoever. And again, I just come back to the fact that the Biden administration is now trying to claim that there's nothing happening that's bad. That is an amazing thing. I mean, Joe Biden's statement that everything is hunky-dory, Kevin Bacon in Animal House standing in front of large-scale explosions in the background saying all is well, everything is fine. It's pretty amazing. And it's particularly amazing given the fact, I do love the idea. They're like, well, this is old data. They're going to pull the same routine when we're in a recession. So right now we are probably in a recession. The way that you measure a recession in the United States and in the Western world is 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. We already have one. That was the first quarter. Quarter 2, they don't actually have a final number on yet. So when people say we're in a recession, people like Joe Biden say, well, we're not technically in a recession because you can't actually know whether we're in a recession until we actually release the stats on Q2. And then the minute that we find out that there was negative growth in Q2, and we say, okay, so I guess we're in a recession, they say, no, because now we're past Q2, we're in Q3. So we're going to play this dumb little time lapse game and try to pretend that people aren't feeling the pinch. The battle for the culture is heating up. We here at the Daily Wire are making some big moves. So be sure to like, subscribe, ring that bell, because you're not going to want to miss a single moment.